see what I mean? He sprayed bullets all over the damn place.
Shooters are a core pillar of the gaming industry, and while most FPS games agree on the fundamentals of gunplay, there's a very important factor that sets them apart from each other: accuracy. How a shooter handles its weapon accuracy says a lot about it. The feeling of the gunplay is very important in establishing the identity, as well as the level of competitiveness of said game. But weapon accuracy plays an important role in something else as well, which is how a game rewards or compensates for skill. An often overlooked feature of weapon accuracy is bloom. Bloom is when the spread of a weapon, the possible areas a shot can land, increases under continued use. You can think of it a bit like a flower blooming, which I'm told is a thing that happens outside sometimes. It's distinct from weapon recoil, which is where your aim is moved horizontally and vertically away from where you are aiming. Most people become aware of bloom when it makes them miss. As a result, it's a mechanic that's not viewed with much favour in online discourse. So why do so many games, including the recent Battlefield 6, rely on randomness to such an extent? Today, we're going to look at bloom within gaming, where it came from, why it exists, and how a good implementation can actually make a game better for everyone. Bloom traces its origins to some of the earliest tactical shooters on PC, games like Counter-Strike, Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon in the early 2000s, and likely even earlier. The mechanic comes from a desire for realism. Guns, in most reasonable cases, aren't pinpoint accurate under sustained use. So in order to encourage a more measured and realistic approach to gunfights, games opted to penalise run and gun tactics by including a level of randomness to where the shots might land. This mechanic, before the more mainstream implementation of aiming down the sights, is how we got the now industry staple crosshairs. And at this point it would be more surprising to find a shooter, first person or otherwise, that does not have it. Bloom eventually found its way into all mainstream shooters in one way or another. Call of Duty, Battlefield and Halo all had the mechanic in some form. One of the clearest and most prolific cases was its inclusion in Halo Reach, with the reticule bloom mechanic, which made even precision weapons lose accuracy if used aggressively. But that does raise an important question. How did the mechanic find almost near universal use if it was originally built for the sake of realism? To really understand the value of bloom as a mechanic, it helps to understand the role that randomness plays in games. A competitive game comes in many forms, but one near universal truth about them is that they are all very deterministic, which is to say that the outcomes of any action are heavily predetermined. To give an example, Counter-Strike uses a recoil pattern mechanic for its weapons, which means that the same pattern happens every time you hold down the trigger on a particular weapon. As a result, you can actually learn and compensate for this pattern to improve your accuracy, giving way to gunplay that is very skill-based, at least compared to most other shooters. You'll find that most competitive games focus on a consistency of outcome, even down to basic things like who you play against, with skill-based matchmaking. It's all in an attempt to ensure that the player has as much control over the result as possible, as the enjoyment comes from the highs and lows of winning and losing, and from being directly responsible for it. Casual games are the polar opposite of this. The objective is not to determine a winner, but to craft a naturally enjoyable experience throughout. This is where the value of randomness, or to be more specific, stochasticity, lies. The less control the player has over the outcomes, the less those outcomes matter in the grand scheme of things, which makes everything else, hopefully, matter a lot more by comparison. It's why party games will use some form of random element, like dice, because it's there to provide a more dynamic experience that can't be optimized down through skill. And since these games rarely match players via skill, it means that everyone gets a chance to enjoy the odd victory every now and then. Casual games will prefer features that minimize individual player control over outcomes, such as catch-up mechanics and large team sizes, as the journey matters a lot more in this case, compared to the destination. It's important to know that casual or competitive isn't a binary. Most games exist somewhere on a line between the two, and can take elements from either side to curate a more specific experience. I think a lot of people would describe Call of Duty as competitive, but not in the same way you would describe Valorant or Counter-Strike 2 as competitive. On the flip side, Battlefield 6 is a casual game, but it's far from the most casual game ever made. To bring the conversation back to bloom, it's by most metrics a random mechanic, as the intensity of bloom used will cause more extreme randomness in your aim. All of this means that the intensity of bloom, both how quickly it happens and how extreme the spread becomes, can be used as a proxy for how casual or competitive a game is supposed to feel. A game with zero bloom is one that is attempting to stay out of the player's way as much as possible, ensuring that players are rewarded or punished for their accuracy. A game with higher bloom is one that is attempting to afford players some leeway, throwing in a bit of random chance to make aim skill matter less. To help understand why this is the case, imagine the extreme ends of bloom intensity, and how differently a shooter would play if your aim had to be pixel perfect, versus one where the shot could literally go anywhere on the screen. This video is mostly just an excuse to talk about what I think is one of the more successful implementations of bloom in recent memory, which is Battlefield 6, as it serves the game excellently and I think helped contribute to the game's feel, and by extension its early success. Because the effectiveness of certain game design choices is largely subjective, there's a very decent chance that people may disagree, but regardless, it's a very interesting use case. While the game has much closer range engagements compared to its recent predecessors, combat can still take place at a variety of ranges, and as a result different weapons have different degrees of accuracy and effectiveness at a given distance. There's a bunch of variables in play, such as damage fall off, fire rate, even regular old recoil, but the main way the game enforces these effective ranges is largely through bloom. Here's a weapon that is extremely effective up close, but suffers very quickly as the distance adds up. Here's a weapon that is very effective at long range, but is a bit too clunky close up. And here's one that has a very consistent output at any range, but is a little underwhelming in the damage department. What you have here is very successful weapon variety that prevents a single meta weapon from ruling over every distance. Different weapons for different use cases, even different weapons for different playstyles, but each one fills a distinct role that has advantages and disadvantages. It's how a weapon roster should be, in my opinion. What I believe is the most important part of this system is that there's not a reasonable way to skill through these disadvantages, and as such, the weapons in Battlefield 6 do a great job in conforming to players' expectations of what is supposed to happen, regardless of who you run into. When you play any shooter, or any game really, you develop certain expectations and tolerances for what is supposed to occur. A good game is one where it consistently meets your expectations to avoid frustrations. If someone is firing an assault rifle at me from an insane distance, it would only be frustrating if they somehow perfectly beam me down. On the flip side, if I'm trying to hit someone from what is clearly outside my effective range, it would be unreasonable for me to be frustrated if I mostly miss. This is where the value of bloom really lies. You can still control bloom through skill, but it enforces diminishing returns. That way you're still rewarded for better aim, but other variables, like positioning and preparedness, can tip the scales in favour of anyone, and it means that you don't necessarily need years of experience to stand a chance. If you take the time to look, you'll find something that works for you, whether it's your first game or your 100th. Sure, if it's your first day on Earth, no amount of bloom is going to save you from going 0-20. And some people are so good that they could overcome basically any disadvantage, but 99% of players exist in the middle, and that's who the system is designed for. It's often a good exercise to dissect why certain mechanics exist in the way that they do, as their value is not immediately apparent upon first viewing, and Bloom is certainly one of them. Usually if the mechanic is irritating, as Bloom can be, a small amount of tuning can make a world of difference. It's one of the main advantages of modern live service games. They're able to be endlessly tuned and modified, which is why it's important that players understand the whats and whys of gameplay choices before flat out demanding their removal. Because if you remove all the friction that games cause, you end up with smooth, ultimately boring experiences, or ones that filter players out for daring to be new or inexperienced, which just leads to their eventual demise. A lot of people often question why games use it in place of just weapon recoil, and the main advantage is that it is blind to control methods and hardware. Recoil's ease of control can change between the stick of a gamepad or a keyboard mouse, and certainly if you're playing at 30 FPS or 300. So with Bloom, you can't just buy your way into a competitive advantage, and it works in a near universal way no matter your setup. It's a tool for the new age. Bloom, I think, is a mechanic that is here to stay ostensibly forever, and I don't think that's a bad thing. If anything, I think it should be utilised more frequently for games that claim to be casual. So next time you miss a spray, try to keep an open mind. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the huge delay on this one. To be really honest with you, I was just playing Stellaris on Battlefield. There's no other reason. If you'd like to see more videos like this, the best way to support the channel is by subscribing and liking the video. All my links can be found below, as well as a track list for the video. See you next time.